Welcome, everybody. I'm Jim Talent, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a former senator from Missouri. It's a great pleasure to be emceeing this event, which means I introduce our honored guest and then have an opportunity to chat with him for a couple minutes before we take your questions. So be thinking of those questions, and when you ask them, please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and then make certain you give them a question rather than a statement, and we'd all appreciate that. It was very encouraging for me personally when this gentleman, as expected, took over the House Armed Services Committee in this Congress. His predecessor did a great job fighting for the capabilities of America's armed forces in a very difficult time, and it is a difficult time for the United States and for our military. And one of the encouraging things is to have our guest today in a position of such influence. Mac Thornberry went into the Congress 20 years ago in 1994, 2 years after I went in. Sometimes you spot somebody when they're new and you recognize that they are capable of and will make a tremendous contribution to the nation's interests over time because of their judgment, their integrity, their willingness to work, and their charity, their understanding that Congress is a place of people with different views. You have to understand how to persuade people on their terms about what's important for the country. And this is the man we have with us today. I'm not going to praise him too much because it'll just embarrass him, but it's wonderful that he's chairing the Armed Services Committee. It's gracious of him to be willing to make remarks and to share his time with us today. And without any further ado, I'll introduce my friend and the new chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry.
Well, thank you, Jim, and I appreciate your words, and I appreciate you and your colleagues here at AEI hosting us today, and as well all of y'all's contributions to the national debate on national security. You know, being selected by my colleagues to chair the Armed Services Committee is certainly a great honor, but it's also a great responsibility. The first, and I believe foremost job of the federal government is to defend the country and our people, and Congress has a unique and irreplaceable role in carrying out that duty. When I walk into our main committee room and see the portraits of some of the former chairmen in there, I find myself wishing for a little Harry Potter magic. Because if you'll remember, at Hogwarts, the headmaster could consult with his predecessors by talking to their portraits. Unfortunately, I haven't found any of them who'll talk back to me yet, but I'm still hoping. And I'm certainly honored to join their ranks. But I'm also sobered by the challenges ahead, for I don't believe that any of my predecessors faced such a wide array of complex national security challenges as we face today. From the renewed aggression of major nuclear powers to grappling with new domains of warfare to failed states, terrorism, horrible diseases, the list of security challenges is certainly long. The head of the British Defense Staff, General Sir Nick Houghton, said last month that the world is becoming a more dangerous, less certain, less predictable, and more unstable place. And I don't know of many people who would disagree with him about that. The dangers are swirling around out there, what Macaulay called the red whirlwind, and Americans and American interests are inevitably swept up into it. We know Americans are uneasy. A poll in November found that 78% felt that the threats to our security are increasing, and 60% felt that we were less secure than we were a year ago. And I suspect that in the last few days after Paris, those numbers are even higher. I mentioned those committee portraits. One of them is of Chairman Carl Vinson. As y'all may remember, Vinson's tenure in Congress was long, about 50 years. He came in with the Springfield rifle and he left with the ICBM. He has an aircraft carrier and our main committee room named after him. Admiral Nimitz said that Vinson forgot more about the Navy than most admirals will ever know. So, needless to say, if any of those pictures do start talking back to me, I hope it's his. But in the 1930s, a time when the threats were large and budgets were tight, Vinson took up the cause of naval modernization. The New Deal and social spending dominated the budget, and although the threats from Germany and Japan were increasing, defense dollars were pretty scarce. But Vinson insisted on buying new ships. We're a maritime nation, and a maritime nation needs a modern navy, he believed. And so after a tough fight, he got his way. So in the 1930s, three large ship hulls were laid down, and those three ships became the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which sank 4 Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway, the turning point of the Pacific. 3,000 Japanese sailors were killed that day, but it could have been 3,000 Americans if it had gone the other way. So when I talk about the job being somewhat sobering, that's part of what I'm thinking about. If Vinson were here today, he might find a very familiar political landscape and very similar frustrations. The deliberate ignorance of danger, the want of strategic forethought, infinite demands to spend money elsewhere, all part of rhythms that Churchill called, mournfully, the endless repetitions of history. Fortunately for the Battle of Midway, Congress got it right. That doesn't mean Congress always gets it right. The country paid a heavy price in the early days of World War II and in Korea, and you might even argue on 9/11, because our national leaders did not see or chose to ignore approaching dangers. Congress consists of 535 human beings from all over the country, from all walks of life, with all our accumulated talents and all our faults. So what is this imperfect body's proper role when it comes to national defense? Well, in the Constitutional Convention, the founders gave certain powers to Congress, which they viewed as the branch closest to the people. James Madison said that these powers ought to exist without limitation because it's impossible to foresee or define the extent or variety of national exigencies. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, at least 6 specific duties were placed on the House and the Senate related to national security, and through those authorities, Congress determines the size, shape, and soul of our military. The President then determines how to use it. Madison also wrote, "Security against foreign danger is one of the primitive objects of civil society. It is an avowed and essential object of the American Union." Well, that fundamental object hadn't changed in 200 years. But of course, the way we meet that objective has to change. The 76th Congress worried about Japan and Germany. The 37th Congress dealt with the Southern Rebellion and the suspension of habeas corpus. Maybe the 13th Congress had it worse. King George burned down their offices. But in our time, Congresses had to deal with a blend of all those things. The thought of the Capitol burning, as it did in 1812, was pretty remote for 2 centuries. But only the courage of the passengers on United Flight 93 prevented it from happening again on 9/11. And only good intelligence and law enforcement stopped a plot just within the past few days. We may not have the same habeas debates, but we sure struggle with the right balance of privacy and security. We don't have Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, but we have a resurgent Russia and a rising China. Through all these repetitions of history, the 114th Congress has exactly the same obligation as the first Congress, and that is to build a military capable of defending the country. It's not clear, however, that everybody understands our constitutional system. Congress is sometimes criticized for exercising our proper role in defense. For example, some of you may have heard that Congress is forcing the Army to buy tanks that it doesn't want because of some donor or some lobbyist or some parochial interest. Well, here's the reality. We made a judgment call. There's one plant in the country left that makes tanks. The Army said that foreign sales would be able to keep that plant occupied until 2019 when they needed it to refurbish our own tanks. So the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, the House and Senate Armed Services Committee went through all of their arguments and believed that their math didn't add up. So we decided to start upgrading our tanks earlier than the Army had planned, to make sure that the plant stayed open, to make sure that the trained workforce stayed engaged, and tanks would get fielded sooner. Now, some may differ on the wisdom of that particular decision, but there is a reasonable, logical national security argument for it. And it turns out, just last month, the U.S. Army sent 100 M1 Abrams tanks back to Europe in response to the Ukraine crisis. Maybe that's some evidence that we made the right call. Obviously, Congress has been criticized for other decisions. One year, the Air Force wanted to discontinue the Global Hawk and rely instead on the 50-year-old U-2. The next year, they proposed exactly the reverse. They asked to retire the A-10 and then a few months later sent it to fly attack missions in Iraq and Syria. The Navy included no money in this year's budget to begin to refuel the George Washington, a carrier with 25 years of life left. And the Pentagon has repeatedly asked Congress for another round of base closure when GAO tells us we have not yet broken even from the last round, which was 10 years ago. Now, in all of these instances, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, disagreed with the administration's request. And that's exactly the way the Founding Fathers intended our system to work. Sometimes the Pentagon is penny-wise and pound-foolish. Sometimes the Pentagon can be parochial. Sometimes the White House tries to cut military spending to put money in other parts of the budget. And sometimes their priorities are just wrong. It was Congress that forced the Pentagon to buy the Predator. They didn't want it. Pilots don't really like pilotless aircraft. It was countercultural. But I don't know of many people who would reverse that decision today. Is Congress sometimes parochial? Of course. Each of us has a responsibility to represent the interests of our district or our state, because if we don't, no one else will. Does Congress sometimes make the wrong call? Absolutely. But please don't fall into what was said in another context, the soft bigotry of low expectations. The Constitution gives Congress the responsibility to raise and support, provide and maintain military capability. Congress can and has in the past risen to meet the historical moment. And that's what you and the American people should expect us to do today, even if the president does not always rise to the moment in carrying out his constitutional duties. Some people expect the lawmakers to just cut the check and don't ask too many questions. But Congress should not give any president a blank check, and Congress should not be a rubber stamp. It's the branch of government most responsible for the character and contours of our military. And that includes the organization and structure. It was Congress that created the War Department in 1789. It was Congress that reorganized it into the Department of Defense in 1947. And it was Congress that restructured the services under Goldwater Nichols. Speaker Sam Rayburn said, "Too many people mistake the deliberations of Congress for its decisions." And I admit that the deliberations that lead up to a bill like Goldwater Nichols can sometimes be pretty messy. But as the complexity of our security challenges grows, so does the necessity of Congress fully living up to our responsibilities under the Constitution and playing our part to defend the country. Doing our constitutional duty also helps connect our people with national policies. A CSIS study more than 10 years ago entitled Beyond Goldwater Nichols has always struck a chord with me, because they said that Congress is a place where ideas become national policies and commitments. Having that messy, frustrating debate in Congress changes the Clinton policy for this or the Bush policy for that into the nation's policies. Congress is the indispensable link to the American people, they wrote, the connective tissue between our national leaders and policies. Well, to be that connective tissue, we in Congress have to do our job, and a big part of that job is building the military capability we need to deal with the threats we can see, but also for the volatile, unpredictable world that we all live in. That requires the United States to have a military that is both strong and agile, and I think we've got a lot of work to do on both fronts. Last Thursday at the Republican retreat, British Prime Minister Tony Blair was there. He repeated the advice he has given the United States for a couple of years now, which was just be strong. Don't worry about whether people around the world love you, he said. What the world needs is for America to be strong. And I think he's exactly right. Of course, to be strong, we've got to stop the slide in defense budgets. That has reduced our base defense spending 21% since 2010. 2 weeks ago on Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace asked General Dempsey if at some point the resources would be cut so much that you'd have to say we can no longer defend this country from the threats we face. Dempsey replied, quote, "Yes, absolutely. And I think it's called sequestration." Now, I can sit here all day and recite facts and figures about sequestration, from the plummeting readiness levels, the long lines of equipment in disrepair, the jets that aren't flying, the soldiers that aren't getting to the rifle range. But really, the problem with sequestration is about a lot more than facts and statistics. It's about whether we have the capability to do what the nation needs and the times demand. It's also very much about the increased danger that comes to our people from diminished training, aging equipment, and a tempo of operation that stretches them and their families just too far. It has to be fixed. Even without sequestration, we have to make good decisions on our investments in people and on technology. Our people, of course, are our most valuable asset. We'll soon get the report of the Military Compensation and Realignment Modernization Commission. We need a comprehensive look, I think, at the whole benefit structure rather than try to nickel and dime our service members to death year after year as the administration has proposed. But I'm going to be looking not just at the financial impacts of that study, but especially about how it affects our ability to recruit and retain the best our country has to offer, because that's the key to our future. We have to improve our acquisition system to get more value out of the money we spend on both goods and services. In 1952, the Navy issued a requirement for a lightweight fighter. 2 years later, the first A-4 Skyhawk flew. 4 years later, the first A-4 squadron was operational, and we built nearly 3,000 of them. Now compare that to the F-22. In 1981, the Air Force established a requirement for 750 advanced tactical fighters. It wasn't until 2005, 24 years later, that the F-22 was first introduced, and instead of 750 of them, we bought 195. If Boeing can field a new commercial airliner in 5 years, if Ford can take a car from design to production in 24 months, then there's absolutely no reason that the Pentagon should take 2 decades to put a new fighter into service. Things have to change. We have an unfortunate tendency to fix organizational problems with more organization. And I've seen estimates that show nearly a third of the acquisition budget goes to overhead cost. This system is so gummed up, it's a wonder sometimes that anything ever comes out the other end. But to have a military that is both strong and agile means that we can't tolerate the delays and cost overruns that have plagued our procurement system. A lack of agility means that vital technology doesn't get to the troops in a timely way, which has the potential to jeopardize their mission, but almost certainly increases the risk to their lives. I'm pretty optimistic that working with Undersecretary Kendall, we can find a way to thin out regulations, simplify procurement, while increasing accountability for program performance. But it won't be easy, and it sure won't be quick. Agility also requires organizational structure that can adapt to meet new challenges, an organizational culture that promotes learning and thinking. In his autobiography, Dr. Edward Teller writes, "The substance with the greatest inertia known to man is the human brain, and the only substance more inert is the collection of human brains found in a large organization, such as a military service or the faculty of a university." Well, maybe he could say that, but with the speed of change we confront, we can't afford inertia or failing to learn and adapt, and we certainly can't tolerate organizations that stifle learning and adaptation. Colonel John Boyd, a reformer who understood the Pentagon and its flaws, warned that complexity causes commanders to be captured by their own internal dynamics, preventing them from adapting to changing circumstances. Look, it goes without saying there are many good people in the Department of Defense doing good work with good results, but too many of them are captured or have their work captured by the accumulation of regulations and bureaucratic processes imposed by Congress and administrations over the years. This issue has to be a major focus of our congressional oversight. That oversight's going to be fair, aggressive, thorough, as the people's and the taxpayers' voice on national security. That's exactly as the framers intended. Part of our job is to update our oversight to fit the kinds of threats we face and the kinds of operations we need to protect the country today. I think we made a good start with new oversight of cyber operations and of sensitive military operations that go on around the world, but we have more work to do. And we have to ensure our oversight is not just focused on the capillaries, but is looking at the big trends that define our world and our security. Of course, that's not a new problem. President Lincoln once asked for a report on a newly developed rifle. When the report arrived, Lincoln took one look at the thick binder and said, "If I send a man to buy a horse from me, I expect the man to tell me the horse's points, not how many hairs he has in his tail." Well, sometimes, as you know, Congress contributes to this problem of too much effort for too little result. So we're going to be looking at ourselves and the reports we require too. But history and common sense tells us that Congress has the indispensable role in reforming the Pentagon. Without us, it will not happen. And as long as I'm privileged to hold this job, defense reform will be a priority, not for its own sake, but for the sake of ensuring that our military is as prepared as possible for the wide array of threats that we face today and the unknown security challenges which will confront us tomorrow. We'll focus on reforms that take us closer to an efficient, effective, accountable Department of Defense with military capability that is both strong and agile. Great powers, and especially great military powers that fail to adapt to shifting realities, are relegated to history. That's been true from the Greeks and the Romans to the Soviets. Updating and strengthening the role Congress plays in national defense, really restoring the role that Congress was always intended to play in national defense, will assist in rebuilding our military and rejuvenating America's role in the world. At one time, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Today, the sun never sets on the security challenges facing the United States of America. And in meeting those challenges, the American soldier never goes to bed. Our challenge in Congress is to fulfill the roles and responsibilities the Constitution places on our shoulders with the courage, dedication, intelligence, commitment to service, just as our military personnel carry out their jobs every single day. Ken Towery is one of the most amazing men I've ever met. Later, winning a Pulitzer Prize, he was a prisoner of war by the Japanese in World War II. In one of his columns, he wrote, "As we have said many times, not all men are called upon to respond to battlefield conditions, but all men and women will face many, many situations where courage and duty and responsibility are required, and where the true measure of their worth is how well they respond to those challenges." In all the noise and clatter of our day, in this age of social media and endless news cycles, it's easy to get distracted from what's important. But we can't afford to be distracted. The world is simply too dangerous. Providing for the common defense is the fundamental obligation of government, and it's the most important job we have. I'll work every single day to see that Congress fulfills that role with the courage and duty and sense of responsibility that is faithful to the founders, faithful to the amazing men and women who serve our country in the military, and also faithful to those generations yet to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Thornberry. Appreciate those remarks, and thank you for coming to the AEI to deliver them. So we're going to chat for just a few minutes. Minutes, and then we're going to go to your questions, and I will attempt to be brief and give you plenty of time to answer. You discussed in your remarks the role of Congress in, as the Constitution says, raising and supporting the armies of the United States and providing and maintaining the navies. Of course, they didn't mention an Air Force in 1787 for understandable reasons. And you know from your experience, I know from mine, that the members and senators who serve on the HASC and the SASC, pretty thoroughly familiar as they should be with these issues. You mentioned there are 535 members total, though. The other ones, you know, they deal with healthcare and education and those kinds of issues day to day all the time. Do you think that they're as familiar as they need to be with military issues? What can be done, I'm not blaming them, but what can be done institutionally to raise a greater awareness of these issues among the other members and senators, do you think?
There's no question that other members are not as familiar as they should be with these issues. And I think that's part of what we face today, as I mentioned, with such a wide array of complex threats. It's just not as simple as it used to be to understand all of the different sorts of challenges we have. But I think it's absolutely true. We've got to put a greater emphasis in our overall gatherings on national security. So it was terrific, for example, last week to have Tony Blair come and talk largely about the U.S. role in the world and how important that was. Members look to members of the Armed Services Committee, you know, for the details of readiness levels and personnel and so forth. But we've got to do a better job in not just, you know, spouting statistics, but in helping other members of Congress understand not only what's happening, but why it's important, how it matters.
Well, it
And
matters
that's on our shoulders.
to them and their constituents.
Yeah, and to our country.
And you remember, and I remember, what a challenge it is when you're new in the committee to absorb and understand the lexicon that the Pentagon uses, and I think a lot of members find that very difficult.
Sure.
You also noted that Carl Vinson, really on his initiative, made certain that we had laid the hulls for the aircraft carriers, which turned out to be vitally necessary, and if he hadn't done that, we wouldn't have had them. So is there a capability that you in particular are concerned we need to have and may not have in the future if we don't take some different, is there a particular thing, I know there's a lot of priorities, is there anything that you are particularly concerned about?
Several things come to mind. One is, back to his point, just the sheer number of ships you have is a big deal, because that is U.S. presence around the world, and the administration has proposed retiring a number of ships in recent years, arguing that, well, modern ships are more capable than old ones. Well, that may be true, but they can still just be at one place at one time. So just there is an importance to the quantity of things, ships and other things. I worry about the capabilities for new domains of warfare, outer space. We have tremendous capability in cyberspace. We don't have the laws and policies to make use of that capability. And last one I'll mention is I continue to be very concerned about biological threats. And it's not that we don't have some capability in the country, but we're really on different tracks. DOD and HHS are not working well together, and yet a biological threat could really be devastating. And I'm afraid we're not doing what we need to in that area either.
I'm glad you're conscious of that. Actually co-chaired a commission with Bob Graham from Florida on WMD terrorism, and we focused on the bio threat. Yeah. It was a real concern that we had. And on the number of ships, I wonder if you recall the hearing where Ike Skelton addressed the whole quality versus quantity issue. And they were talking about we didn't need as many ships because of the quality of and the capabilities of those we had. And he said, well, I got an idea. Why don't we just have a Navy with one ship that can do everything?
One super ship. Yeah.
I think Ike made a really good point there. Okay, I'd love to know your thinking about this, because it was, you've talked about institutional issues here with the Congress, so let's talk about another institutional issue, the chiefs, okay? And they have to, it's a difficult line for them to walk. They're in a chain of command, and it's their responsibility to obviously to acquiesce and salute and attempt to execute administration decisions. They have a competing or a concurrent and sometimes competing responsibility to give the Congress, and in particular the HASC and the SASC, their best and most honest professional judgment about the issues that they confront. And I think we all sympathize that's difficult for them sometimes. Is there a message you, at the beginning of your tenure, might want to send to the chiefs in that regard?
Well, it would be, we expect you to shoot straight with us. I don't think it is fair to expect them to become advocates for our positions, especially if they contradict the president's. But we have to have the information, and it is, as you point out, their obligation is not just to the president, but it's to the country, and that includes Congress in its key role in providing for the military, which is part of the reason I think we've gotten a little out of kilter when we talk about Congress and national security. And one of the reasons I thought it's important to start out by reminding everybody just how central Congress is in carrying out those duties. And if the chiefs are reminded, so much the better.
Yeah, I really appreciated your references to the Constitution, and I know you're aware of another constitutional provision that bears on this. The powers granted in Article 1 of the Constitution to the Congress are permissive. You don't have to have a bankruptcy code, right? Yeah. But Article 4 says the United States shall protect the states from invasion, the one mandatory function.
Which takes on all sorts of new implications given what Texas faced, for example, last summer. It may have been an invasion of minors, but still thousands of people streaming across our border presented all sorts of challenges. And it's the federal government's responsibility, absolutely, to deal with that.
There's definitely a direct national security component to that issue. All right, I want to just, and then I'm going to open this up for questions. I want to get a little bit into acquisition reform, and your words couldn't have been more important or true in that, and I especially appreciated this sentence. You don't fix organizational problems with more organization. Well, hurrah for you in saying that. So do you want to share with us, and I know you're going to hold hearings and you don't want to prejudge the outcome, what things you may be thinking of as the right path to acquisition reform, and I'll give you as a jumping off point if you want to take it, the National Defense Panel's recommendations over the years that we really discipline ourselves to trying to design and develop platforms that we can design and develop in at most 5 to 7 years, and then spirally, evolve them over time. You mentioned A4 and F-16s like that, so, but don't be restricted to that.
I think that's a great point. As you know, Chairman McKeon asked me to start trying to coordinate this effort last year, and so we have gotten a tremendous amount of very valuable input from people in the system, from industry, from a variety of folks that have looked at this over the years. I haven't found anybody who says, okay, it's all fine, don't worry about it, this is not really a problem. What I have found are people kind of like you that say, okay, this has been tried before and it usually gets worse, so why are you going to make it better? And there's that sort of skepticism. So I think what we'll, in this spring, I will probably put some proposals out there, ask for people's feedback, and then the idea would be maybe they would be incorporated into this year's NDAA. But a really important point is, to me, there is not going to be a 2,000-page bill that solves acquisition. It does not exist. Nobody's that smart. What we will do is first try to do no harm. Secondly, try to make some things a little better. And then next year, try to make some more things better. And next year, try to make some more things better and keep after it, as I say, as long as I have this job. But your point about the NDP, I think, raises another point. This is not just about legislation or even about regulations. It's also about how we conduct oversight of these programs. So Congress can help make sure that there is not the kinds of requirements creep that has delayed and resulted in cost overruns over the year. So part of it is how we do our job in budgeting and in oversight, not just in putting out a new regulation or repealing some regulations. And again, you're not, in the best of circumstances, you're not just going to fix acquisition. But it's just, the world is moving too fast for us to be satisfied with the pace of acquisition, the pace of fielding technology today. I mean, that's why, I'm sorry, I get carried away by this, as you can tell. That's why you get folks who are deployed overseas who take their cell phones with them, Because what you can go buy at the Verizon store is a whole lot better than what you'll get and sometimes issued. Why, So we got a lot of work to do, but it's really important.
Really appreciate your emphasis on accountability, and former Secretary of the Navy John Lehman, who you know well, and John was as responsible as anybody for building up the number of ships in the Navy in the 80s, and he constantly emphasized accountability within a tight chain of command within the department.
And that's what you got to have, because, I mean, the problem now is if you want to hold somebody accountable for a program that's gone off the rails, who do you hold accountable? There are so many people who are a part of the decision making who can at least slow things down or change it, that it's hard to know who to hold accountable. We got to do better than that.
And once with accountability goes responsibility and authority too. Right. And I think the program managers and the chiefs and service secretaries would be pleased to know that your oversight is going to be exacting but supportive for those who make those kinds of decisions. Okay, let's, I don't want to hog the chairman, so let's open this up for question. Remember, you need to wait till we get a microphone and then give us your name. Yeah, go ahead. Sydney.
Senator, Chairman, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. You mentioned a couple of times reports, repeals. Quite a few people, General Punaro, Sean Stackley have said the first thing Congress needs to do on acquisition reform is repeal some of the layers of organization that have been added, to actually go back and cut away things. You mentioned that as sort of one of the arrows in the quiver, but how big a piece of what you're considering is that? How high on the agenda is just going through the law and striking stuff out as opposed to rewriting or adding?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple parts. As I mentioned, Secretary Kendall has been working with us to identify duplicative, overlapping regulations that either he can thin out or working together we can thin out. And so that process is going well and is pretty far along. And then taking some additional steps will require us acting to change or repeal some laws. I don't know how far we can go until we see what the market can bear. That's part of the reason we're not going to just throw out an acquisition package and try to get it through the committee in a short time frame. I want to hear feedback. And so that back and forth discussion, hopefully, not just this year, but in years to come, will help us get back towards that accountability that Jim and I were just talking about. Because I remember, it's not about bureaucracy, it's not about just organizations, it is about who has the authority, and then can you hold them accountable for the exercise of that authority? And that's the goal we got to move toward.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Otto Kreischer with Sea Power Magazine. You emphasized basically funding. DOD, the military needs more funding. Sequestration is the problem. Are you proposing some kind of a repeal of sequestration? And do you intend to do it only on defense? You've seen the Democrats' response already. Bernie Sanders saying that you're never going to get an increase in defense spending unless you also do something on the domestic side. What's the solution to sequestration that you see?
Yeah. Well, I guess my primary point is it has to be fixed. Now, that fix has got to pass the House of Representatives, it's got to pass the Senate, and it's got to be signed into law by the President. So what that means is the Armed Services Committee alone cannot fix it. You got to have 218 and 60 and 1 to get it done. So I don't know that anybody has a magic formula to do that, or else it would be done by now. But yet, I think it's really important for us, as Jim and I were talking, to help all our members understand the damage that has been done, and actually the way that it is more expensive in a lot of respects to operate under sequestration, the inability to plan, et cetera, and so what it costs us. I really believe that most Republicans and most Democrats in the House and the Senate agree that sequestration for defense needs to be fixed. What there is not agreement upon is exactly how to fix it. And again, whatever can pass the House and pass the Senate and get signed into law by the President, I think I'm for.
And I think it's very relevant because the greater the sense of urgency, the greater the understanding of the problem that the average member of the Senate has, the greater the sense of urgency to fix it, and the greater possibility of coming to the kind of agreement you're talking about.
Yeah, the challenge is our military, bends over backwards to get the mission done. And so what you don't see is the delayed maintenance, the training that doesn't happen, et cetera. It's a little harder to quantify, harder to see. That's what we have to help people understand.
Let me go to that lady in the back on the aisle there.
Hi, my name is Erica McCann with the IT Alliance for Public Sector. We're a division of ITI. And I just wanted to thank you for your leadership over the past year, bringing the Armed Services Committees together to look at acquisition reform. One of the things that we found is one of the hardest nuts to crack so far is on appropriations and funding in order to enable faster, more agile IT acquisitions at the department. So I was wondering, how are you starting to look at that process? Where do you see flexibilities, and have you started to engage the appropriations folks to start talking about ways to enable faster IT acquisitions?
Sure. We've absolutely been discussing with the appropriations folks not only acquisition reform, but everything that we're interested in. I really don't think there has been a time that I've seen in the last 20 years where there has been closer collaboration between the Armed Services Committee and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. And I think that's only going to get stronger. And Rodney and I are determined to make it so. I think you mentioned IT acquisition. That presents special challenges. There have been some folks who say, okay, we need just a separate authority or a separate way to procure IT, and then you start looking, okay, exactly what is IT? Well, it's integral to most everything we buy. So it's pretty hard to segregate it out, and yet you have that area that changes so rapidly and makes it difficult, especially for the current procurement system, to keep up with technology to field the best for our folks. So I think there are some authorities we're looking at, and hopefully some things some brush we can clear away to improve it. Again, there's not a magic answer here. What we can do is hopefully make it better than it is now, and then keep working to make it better. And IT is going to be a key focus of what we try to gauge that, of how we try to gauge that.
Yes.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin with National Defense. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to ask you about some of these budget priorities that you say that the Pentagon is wrong about, like funding more tanks, ships, and retiring airplanes that you don't believe should be retired. The Pentagon says by funding these things, it takes their money away from readiness. So they have to choose, and they choose readiness. So what kind of budget maneuvering is going to have to take place to be able to fund what Congress believes is important, but also what the readiness that the Pentagon believes they need? Thank you.
Well, I think this gets back somewhat to the discussion we were having just a few minutes ago. So under sequestration, with those reductions, and again, 21% in real terms in the base budget, that's how much it's been cut since 2010. And that has to have an impact. Now, part of the rest of the story is, as those of us in Congress, I think, look at the world, we're saying, we don't know that we want to give up the A-10 or the ability to have tanks or the 25 years left on the George Washington. Is there a cost to preserving that option this year? Sure. But it just adds, I think, a sense of urgency that we've got to get this overall budget on a more reasonable footing. And then, are there going to be difficult choices, systems that have to be retired? Of course. But with the volatility that we've seen in defense budgets and so forth, and with the volatility in the world situation, most of us want to be pretty careful about giving things away, because it's going to be really hard to give them back. And my key thing in my mind is when it comes to BRAC, I mentioned 10 years, and GAO says we have not yet broken even from the last BRAC. So it's going to cost money, and the rest of the story is, if we give up a base, give up a training range, then it's gone forever. And are we sure, have we thought enough about our role in the world, the kind of military capability it needs to fulfill that role, and what sort of basing then is needed for that military capability? Have we worked our way through the steps so that someday we won't come and say, man, I wish I had that training range back? That's part of that same sort of caution about giving things up that someday you may regret in such a volatile world.
National Defense Panel was very supportive of that analysis because, as you know, we recommended that the department really come up with a real long-term plan, and until you have a sound long-term plan about what force structure you're going to need, you don't want to give up a bunch of bases and then have to rebuild them again down the road.
Well, and we're not going to have a place to rebuild some of them. I mean,
right.
Particularly ranges and so forth are very valuable in this country, and so it would be hard to reconstitute them if we give them up.
Do you, in the context of not giving things away, do you want just a brief comment about industrial base issues? And because you mentioned, obviously, you're focusing acquisition reform, one of the keys to that is being able to compete these programs, which means you have to have a reasonably robust industrial base. Do you want to make a comment on that?
Well, I think those are some of the hardest issues we face and will face. I mean, I mentioned the tank example. What if we decided that it was just not worth the money to put into that plant because we didn't really need it today, and it closed? We lose the capability, we've got to pay a lot more to reconstitute it, or else we got to go buy it from foreign sources. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we're facing that sort of situation in a lot of different areas where we've got to decide whether to put money into something that we may not need right now just to preserve the capability of having it domestically. And I think those are going to present some of the most difficult challenges or decisions for us, for the country going forward.
Yes, Tom.
Good morning, Mr. Thornberry. Tom Donnelly from AI. Just thanks for joining us and honoring us with a very thoughtful speech, which sets me up for an opportunity to let you make a headline that will destroy all your hard work so far. And I'd like to ask a question about the politics of the defense budget in the new Republican Congress. And there's a larger majority, largest majority in a long time for Republicans in the House. And really the first hurdle for this year is the budget resolution, if you're trying to undo sequestration. And last year's projection, the number for 2016 in last year's budget resolution included a pretty substantial increase in the defense top line. Since then, the world has gotten scarier and American interests more at risk. Let me ask you a very narrow question, if I may. Would you accept anything less than the figure specified in last year's budget resolution, which I believe was $541 billion? B, do you think that's enough? And C, how do you think your colleagues in the Republican caucus will respond to this proposition?
Before you answer, Mr. Chairman, everybody here has been very good about not making long statements before their question, except one of our AEI scholars who could not resist the temptation to do so. Nevertheless, if you want to graciously answer it.
Who at one
leave that up to
time
you.
worked on the House Armed Services Committee.
Yeah.
So he's
I
got
think there's
double.
a connection.
Yeah, maybe. Here, one of the things I've learned and I believe is be really careful about drawing red lines, because if you draw a red line and then you don't live up to it, your credibility goes down. And if you think about what's happening in the United States, around the world, as far as the United States and our credibility, the stories that we've seen this weekend about, well, maybe Assad can stay after all, it says something about our credibility, our ability to have influence in the world. And so I take that lesson and say, I'm not going to say not one dime less, because one dime less would still be, a whole lot better than a lot less. So I don't know that there is a magic number it has to be, but clearly there has to be some relief from this, what is a real cut. If you take inflation into account, defense spending, base defense spending will go from 521 to 515 under the sequestration caps for 2016. That's a real cut. And as you mentioned, the world is getting more dangerous. The other thing just to keep in mind, and that made me think of it in your question, is when you ask voters just before the last November election, what's most important to you, what's going to determine your vote? Number one was jobs in the economy. Number two was national security. So as all of these things, as I say, the red whirlwind swirling around the world of terrorism and the other things, this is very high on voters' minds, on their concerns, and that translates through, I think, to their elected representatives. We just have to be able to talk together enough to find the path forward. And I want to emphasize that has to include the President of the United States. It's not enough to sit up there and throw tomatoes. He's got to engage in a reasonable conversation about how we get from here to there that can pass the House, pass the Senate, and get his signature.
Hi, Scott Massioni with Inside the Pentagon. The OCA budget's been increasingly criticized as a slush fund for the executive branch. Do you plan on trying to get the executive branch to transition some of those funds into the base budget in the near future?
Well, we've been working on that to not make up for base budget deficiencies in OCO, but to move those programs over to the base budget so that OCO can be used for its intended design, and that is the funding of current operations that are happening around the world. what you hear some people say is, well, it doesn't really matter about these low sequestration caps you all are talking about. We'll just make up for the difference in OCO. That's not a good way to run a railroad. It's not a way that enables managers to plan. As I mentioned, it costs more to do things that way, and it does not reassure the world about our commitment to our allies and to our country's interests. So it's not a good way to go, and so I hope we can move things into the base budget, understanding that you still need OCO for operations that you don't expect, or even that you do expect. So, and the pace of those operations is accelerating, obviously.
Hi, Megan Eckstein with Defense Daily. On acquisition reform, you and Secretary Kendall seem to be very much in line with your priorities for how to go about your reform. I was wondering if you've spoken to Senator McCain about his perspectives. He obviously has very serious concerns about acquisition. And to what extent will you be partnering versus maybe taking different approaches and trying to combine?
We have spoken about it several times, and I think acquisition reform is going to be very high on his list of priorities, just as it is very high on my list of priorities. So I am very optimistic that with Senator McCain's emphasis and our emphasis in the House, with presumably Secretary Carter and then Undersecretary Kendall, we're going to have a group of folks who really want to get things done. Folks in both parties on Capitol Hill. So that's part of the reason I'm fairly optimistic. Just don't expect everything to be solved in a single bound. It doesn't work that way, and it's dangerous to try. So we just need to take it step by step.
Okay, I think we have time for two more, so I'm going to go here and then back over there. So this gentleman here.
Dana Baylor, the Elwood Group. Thanks very much for your leadership. What can industry, this is a practical question, what can industry do to support your goals and build trust with the Department of Defense? We need to reverse the adversarial environment that exists today. What could we in industry do to support you?
Well, industry has already done a lot, and I will continue to rely on industry a lot as we work our way through some of these reform proposals, because that is an issue that comes up a fair amount. I've had people in industry tell me, look, we could give them a much better deal, but they won't talk to us. Well, I mean, there are certain ethical guidelines that make sense, but we've all seen swinging pendulums that go too far and end up doing at least as much harm as they do benefit. So that's part of the reason I emphasize so much greater flexibility, simplification with accountability on the part of government. And I think if you have that empowers them to not be so cautious about having these exchanges with industry. Because if you look back in history, the United States is really unique in the world at the partnership between government and industry that provides for our military capability. And the extent to which there is tension in that relationship, or that those ties are frayed, it makes it harder for us to defend the country. Now again, we don't want, sweetheart deals and revolving, whatever all of those terms are that you get into there. But we ought to do what makes sense, and what makes sense is encouraging, really, in an ethical construct, that exchange between government and industry.
All right, one final question here.
Hi. Thanks, Maggie Barra, Washington Times. The FY12 NDAA puts restrictions on reimbursement funds to Pakistan. Under that guidance, Pakistan has to meet certain counterterrorism goals before it can obtain those funds, and it's DoD's job to certify that Pakistan met those goals. In FY13 and FY14, DoD waived that certification. What are your thoughts on Pakistan not living up to congressional requirements, DoD's decision to give Pakistan a pass, and do you foresee any tweaks to legislative language in FY16 on this topic?
Did you get that?
I think I got the gist
We got a
of it.
little echo.
Yeah, a little hard to hear. Obviously, we have goals that we want Pakistan to achieve. And it is just as clear that Pakistan plays an important role in helping provide for our troops in Afghanistan, in fighting the Al-Qaeda core and other terrorist groups that are in the Afghan-Pakistan region. So needless to say, it's a balance. How much carrot, how much stick best achieves the desired results. I gotta say, I appreciate the military operations they have undertaken in the FATA. It has put pressure on in an area where there hasn't been a lot of military pressure before. And I think all of us, our hearts, just break with the sort of school shooting terrorism that they endured. We imagine something like that potentially happening elsewhere. So they're a partner. It's been an up and down relationship, but we want to use the right combination of carrots and sticks to get to the best place. And that has to be evaluated step by step as we go.
Very well. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your great service and your remarks and your willingness to answer questions. And thanks to all of you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Great.